I would be thinking about you as I was recovering.
Yeah, that's what I, that's
On game controllers. Here, there's app library and widgets on your home screen.
And you mentioned about marijuana, another drug from earlier times that was kind of looked upon as like a devil drug, and now we're seeing states and more people using marijuana. It's becoming legal in a lot of places. Uh,
Right.
Talk to us about how far marijuana has come in this country from being looked upon as a terrible drug and to now where people are looking at it in medical research and how it can use to aid and help people with their bodies.
Well, marijuana, it comes from uh, in the United States. It came into the United States first of all through hemp, right? Like people,
Mhm.
even like in Kentucky, was a big hemp producer in the 19th century. Hemp, they used the fibers of the hemp to make rope and canvas and bags and stuff like that.
Mhm.
And people were also using the seeds and the buds to get high, although not very much because the hemp seeds that are grown on plantations like at Waveland here outside of Lexington, they're not very potent. Marijuana, they call it the marijuana complex, like using cannabis, not just for like hemp and all that kind of stuff, but mostly for the drug, using, the buds and the leaves to smoke and to alter your mood. That came into the United States through Latin America and the Caribbean, through Latino and Black people. So the early places where marijuana was being used in the 20th century in the United States was New Orleans and throughout the American Southwest where Mexican Americans were using it. Although there was also, it's part of the pharmacy in the 19th century. So it was they could get marijuana, pharmacists would stock it, but it wasn't very well known, wasn't very used. There was a guy in the middle of the 19th century who wrote about hashish and how he came across that. He was working in a pharmacy, Ludlow, I think his name is. And he wrote a book about his experiences taking hashish and how, which is the resin of the cannabis, and it's much more
Right.
potent and fast acting than marijuana. So he was using hashish for a while, and he wrote about that and his experiences. But that was just sort of it came and went and didn't become a movement. It was a little bit of a movement among bohemian artists and writers in Paris in the middle of the 19th century. They had a club of people who would take hashish together, poets and that sort of thing. But again, that didn't really translate into the United States, and it didn't become, I don't think, it didn't blossom into larger culture in France either. So it comes into the United States from Mexico and from the Caribbean, and it comes into the United States with all the sort of stereotypes that people had about it in those areas, and the stereotypes people had about the people who are using it, African Americans and Mexican Americans. So it was seen as dangerous because Black people and Mexican Americans were seen as dangerous and deviant, all this sort of thing. So the mainstream white culture is demonizing it. And then you get movies like Reefer Madness that came out in, I think, the 1930s, warning kids against marijuana, and with this very exaggerated sort of consequences for use of marijuana that most people wouldn't recognize as being how cannabis actually works on the mind and the body, right?
Right.
And so they're using these scare tactics, and they're writing cartoons and sort of pulp fiction novels also warning about the dangers of marijuana. And as jazz becomes a big deal in the middle of the 20th century, and white people are attracted to jazz, they start hanging out at jazz clubs and they start using marijuana, and marijuana starts, the beats start using marijuana, and of course it breaks out into, middle-class white kids are using it in the 1960s and 70s, and it explodes into, white middle-class culture, right? You have kids in suburban high schools smoking marijuana, right? So this is what suburban high schools are supposed to be about, to keep the middle-class white kids away from the city, away from people of color who are doing these sorts of things. So here it is, it's out in the open now, and people are panicking. So that's sort of, how things got to be where they are by the middle of the 20th century.
And how is that transition? Because we have slowly but surely, because growing up, I would never, like, I was always taught like marijuana was bad. Like they had a DARE program, people
Yeah.
coming to our schools talking about marijuana is bad. But now almost at age 22, We're seeing CBD places.
Right.
We're seeing marijuana legal in states, like people
Yeah.
pushing for it. Like, where do you see, or how do you think this came about, and why all of a sudden people are looking at this as sort of a like a positive drug and like a useful drug in society today? Because as you explained, it was demonized because it would got into the hands of whether it be in Black people or Mexican people, and once it touched white suburbia, people was demonizing it. Why do you think today people are kind of like having a different outlook on marijuana?
Well, you're absolutely right. It's so much out in the open. So, where do you live? Do you live in Kentucky?
Yeah, I do. I live in Lexington right now. I'm from Louisville originally.
Okay, so less so in Kentucky, but like my family went out for a Western trip last year. We were in California, and we could just rolling down the street, you could smell the marijuana just if you just in the road, right? Other people
Right.
driving around and smoking weed. And my 2 teenage daughters they know what marijuana smells like thanks to our trip out west. So out in California, it's everywhere, right?
Yeah.
So, and it'll come to Kentucky eventually. This will be the same way, probably. Well, I think there's 2 big reasons why it's changed. Number one is that, young people are using marijuana, and they're also using heroin and angel dust and very powerful drugs, cocaine. People realize, oh, those drugs, they're different. The government treats them the same. The educational system treated them the same.
Mm.
But marijuana is just not as powerful. It cannot destroy your life in the same way that heroin, opium, angel dust, things like that can do. And so just through familiarity, people realize that marijuana it's just not as powerful. It doesn't have the same highs, but it doesn't have the same lows, and doesn't have the same ability to really ruin someone's life the way that these other more powerful drugs are.
Right.
Which also made them tune off when they thought the government was lying to them about heroin, cocaine as well. So that was a problem. But just through familiarity, people realized that marijuana is just not as bad as some of these other drugs. And the other thing that happened was that marijuana became used once again as a medicine, right? And so that you have in the early legalization movement in the 1970s and 80s was trying to promote marijuana as a way to help different illnesses like glaucoma, which in fact it does, I think, have some effect in helping ease glaucoma. And then when HIV and AIDS came along, this was the way that, you can use marijuana to help people who are going through that process, or going through taking the very serious, the drugs that you use now to keep people with HIV from getting AIDS are a lot less severe than they used to be, but the early doses were really hard on the body. And so marijuana would help with that. So this is like ways that you can use, marijuana, look, it's a medicine. It's good for you. You can't abuse it. And this is why they started to legalize it as a medicine. So you have dispensaries, and this is where it starts in places like California and as a medical marijuana before it becomes decriminalized recreational marijuana. If you can use this to help people, then it becomes acceptable, right? And because you're looking at all these deviant hippies in San Francisco with their long hair smoking marijuana, that's bad. But like, here's someone with cancer, right? It helps people with cancer, and it helps them eat if they're going through chemotherapy. So that's good. So when we were out in California, I was talking to my friend, and she had cancer a few years ago, and she said, she'd never smoked weed before, but when she was going through chemotherapy, she couldn't even drink water and keep it down. And her husband went out and got some marijuana, and I think she ate a brownie or something like that, and she could drink water and she could eat for the first time. And so, marijuana really helped her get through that. But she's also saying it's crazy how much has changed. Like, of course I voted for legalization of marijuana because it helped me and it's going to help people. Right. But now it's like it's being grown everywhere and it seems to be taking over. And she's like, I don't know if I want that, right?
Yeah.
So we don't know where it's going to go. And people also ask, like, maybe this is going to be good for Eastern Kentucky, right? They're already growing marijuana out there. Maybe it's going to help the economy. But it's not, because California is going to take over the agriculture of that, just like they do for everything else.
That's what I was going to get into. And I know that's a lot of worry for a lot of people, that when marijuana becomes so prevalent and most states start to like growing it and accepting it, people are going to worry about like the distribution of it and the potency of the marijuana once like the government get their hands on it. Do you kind of have that same type of feeling towards it as well?
Well, I'm not sure if it's the government's the problem. The problem is twofold. Number one, the people who wanted to open up marijuana, they don't want any restriction on it at all.
Okay.
Now you have people selling gummy, edibles, right?
Right.
Which is fine. But if you've got little kids and they find your gummy bears or your brownies and they don't know what it is, they're going to eat it and they're going to take a high dose of cannabis in their system, and that's not good.
Right.
And it's just there's very little regulation of it, and we're not sure what's going to happen. And of course, we have a whole business structure set up in place to take a plant and then process it and put it into things that you can smoke or otherwise put in your body already, and that's the tobacco industry. And they have been hammered by the fall of cigarette use, and this is a way for maybe them to make money. So now also it's like, oh, who's going to benefit from the sale of marijuana? Is going to be the same people who grow marijuana before, or is it going to be big businesses? And once big businesses get in charge of it, they have lobbyists. They're going to lobby for no regulation. They're going to lobby for people taking more marijuana. It's going to be interesting to see what happens. This is a whole new frontier, and marijuana is not as dangerous as heroin and cocaine. But if you're smoking marijuana every day and you can't stop, that's bad, right? It can mess up your life. Just like we talked about how addiction, our understanding of addiction has changed. It includes things like addiction to the internet, addiction to pornography. It doesn't have to be heroin. It doesn't have to be cocaine. And you can spend your whole life playing video games and ruin your life that way. If you're getting baked every day, that's not good, right? It's hard to function as a adult, rational person if you're stoned all the time. And so we're going to see if that's going to happen. Is this going to lead to more people using marijuana and more people becoming dependent on marijuana? Or is it going to be lobbyists working for big companies who are going to try to keep marijuana sales flowing freely and claiming that, oh, no, it's all good, it's fine? We don't know what's going to happen. And it'll be interesting to see. All these sort of rituals and stuff that that dictate how people use alcohol. Like, usually at night, usually with other people.
In a social setting.
In a social setting.
Right.
Don't drive when you're drunk, all this kind of stuff. We don't have those rituals. People who smoke marijuana already have rituals, but that's all dependent on it being illegal. Right. So the rituals include putting your towel underneath your door in the dorm room, right? Those are the rituals that we have.
Right, turn the shower on, make sure it steams it out.
Yeah, so all that, we're going to have to come up with new rituals as it becomes, legal and accepted by everybody. Not everybody, but by most people, right? It's be like a dinner party. Do you have marijuana before or after dinner?
Right.
How much? And, can you have it in front of kids? Can you have it while you're watching someone else's kids? Can you smoke a joint? That kind of stuff. We don't know. That's a whole new uncharted territory.
It's very new and uncharted. And one thing, like I said, I've been seeing the progressiveness of marijuana use, even like it translates in sports. I've heard athletes come out and talk because they said they're usually prescribed opioids and they rather have marijuana instead because to them it could be less addictive because going to what you said in addiction, everybody can be addicted to something, whether it be video games or pornography or anything. People's levels of addiction are different. And they say with marijuana, they feel they'll be less addicted to it versus opioids. And MLB, they came out, I think I want to say like last year before the season started or sometime in the off season this past season, they have banned they allowed players to use marijuana. So they will no longer penalize players for that. Do you kind of see like more sports and companies going this direction as well? And kind of steering away from opioids towards marijuana.
Yeah, there's definitely a movement among athletes. What I know about mostly is pro football, and of course, football is so painful.
It is
all the big injuries we hear about, but just being banged up by those other super strong, super fast guys every single day. That football players have been leading the charge. First, the people who have been retired, like the guy who was the running back. He played for
Marshawn Lynch.
No, I'm thinking of the guy who he quit football for a while because he kept getting caught with marijuana. He was a Texas Longhorn, and then he was a Reggie. I can't remember his name, but he was a proselytizer for marijuana while he was playing a little bit. Now, much more so now that he's done. There's a guy named Nate Jackson who's written about it. He was an undersized tight end for a few seasons. He's a writer now. And he's talked about how, this is, like you say, but the league's answer is opioids. And he's like, well, that's terrible. That's bad, right? It gets people addicted. And even if not, it doesn't, it's a stressful thing to put into your body as opposed to marijuana. So, and as the states make it legal, I mean, it's weird for the 49ers to say you can't use marijuana when it's legal to do it for everyone else in the city.
Right.
So if it becomes the case that all the states or the federal government makes it legal, then it would be hard to say to NFL players and NBA players who also their bodies go through a lot, you can't smoke weed to take the edge off. I mean, this is the way the bodybuilders have done it also, right? There's pictures. Did I show a picture in class of Arnold Schwarzenegger with a huge spliff? Yeah. So he works out. He puts all the stress on his body, lifting weights, and then they would smoke marijuana to take the edge off. So it's who knows? I mean, it's part of the whole issue with sports of performance-enhancing drugs. Will marijuana be seen as a performance-enhancing drug? Or will it be seen as just a painkiller that helps people get through the stresses of the game? It'll be an interesting question for society to answer. But if marijuana becomes legal for everybody else, it'll be hard to keep it away from professional athletes, probably.
It would be definitely hard. And as far as it labeled as a PED, I don't know if marijuana could be labeled as like a performance-enhancing. I'm more so, like you said, on the side of like its use as a pain reliever, because you've seen most athletes talking about, they even come out, there's some athletes, not current athletes, but like athletes that are retired, and they talk about how they used it all the time when they was playing, like after games. Yeah. Some players even did it before games, and there have been instances where some players play good while on it, some players play bad while on it. So it's very interesting to see where it goes in the future.